Yeah, and you will be discovered. And he graduated in 2012 from Florida State University and worked with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. And he's deals with understanding the social impacts of infrastructure development in the Brazilian Amazon. So,
Thanks, Sebastian. And thank you for having me. As long as we have a little bit of extra time, I can fill in with an anecdote, I guess. I was at CLAG, the Conference of Latin American Geographers, which was very good. We got to organize a number of sessions, which was wonderful. The only problem was the first session ran a little bit late, so people left to get refreshments, and I was starting the next session. And people didn't really come back, and to make things worse, they decided to put a poster session right outside the doors, so it was very loud. And then the real kicker was, and I think you've experienced with these, were the automatic locks locked everyone from the outside. So there was all this noise, and then about a third of the presentation, people started rattling the doors trying to get in. So of course, when I at the end, I said, okay, any questions? I don't think anybody really had a chance to hear me, so this is a great chance for some retribution. And when I saw that you needed a speaker, I thought, well, I already have a kind of bullet in the chamber here, so I can give this again. Yeah.
Great debut.
So it's very wonderful to be here. I know the title can be maybe a little deceiving, but yes, I'm looking at the hydropower impacts on heterotopias, this is from Foucault, and spaces of conflict, which other people have used more malleably, and in a specific case study session or setting in Maraba, Brazil. You might have heard Bob talk more about, or speak to you about these large ERSA projects that are currently taking shape in the Amazon and how they're extensions of stronger historical processes. But my focus, and it's not to say that there's any one right or wrong way about going about it, is to focus sort of more on the local impacts of a particular dam in an area that's known for sort of a history of violence and contention, as opposed to a much larger scale study. That being said, I will discuss some relevancy in terms of the scalar interactions that help to produce local conflicts. So to begin with, I was going to start with just kind of more of a broad, maybe introduction, I guess, to social conflict and hydropower infrastructure development in the Amazon. I'm sure it's something that people have probably heard of. And then I'm going to move on to the sort of more of a framework that discusses heterotopias and the multiple meanings behind space, and in particular, what I mean when I say spaces of conflict. And the first part, and really the first main chapter of my thesis is about Maraba as a case study, and we're looking at these different historical processes that shape conflicts that will now be impacted by a new process of development through road building and dam building. And so the methodologies I think are important to talk about, in particular where some of this data comes from and how I'm using it. It's not the most accurate, I guess you would say, and there are some aspects of it which I don't like. Unfortunately, being someone who can't do it to field work for this study, I've had to work with different data types, and hopefully this will give us a kind of broad way of looking at how different spaces might be impacted by hydropower. And then I'm going to go into the analysis itself and specifically talk more about land conflict and potentially impacted areas. So to begin, there's been a lot of literature on different dams in the Brazilian Amazon, the Tropilunch, Balbina, and now more recently the resurgence of the Madeira projects. And what we find in a lot of this literature is what Tony Oliver Smith, who of course is here at UF, and Chris DeWitt would call development-induced displacement. The idea that there would be these impacts caused by development which would create dislocation and changes in place and that sort of thing. But it's important to remember that when we talk about development-induced displacement, it's not only sort of these primary impacts that take place, but also the secondary, more causal effects. Those are much harder to predict and measure. So you'll see some ways that I've tried to go about that. But basically, I'm trying to highlight the more historical, social, economic, political, and cultural processes that are embedded in a lot of these conflicts in the study area. So when I talk about heterotopias and spaces of conflict, what the first thing that I think that's important to remember is that this is a case study approach. And we're drawing here from McAdam, Taro, and Tilley's ideas of mechanisms, these contentious mechanisms that are already in place in Maraba. I think it's important to note that these sort of more site-specific mechanisms that are in place in Maraba are part of this larger process that's involved these historically contradictory policies regarding national and international development, where on one hand you might have more populist concerns like agrarian reform and human rights movements for environmental protection, and on the other side you also have pro-development policies, right? So infrastructure expansion, that should be agro-industrial, not ag-industrial, I apologize, but agro-industrial expansion and also mineral exploitation, and these two forces tend to be contradicting in nature, but they take place and they overlap in certain spaces. And in particular, I'm trying to demonstrate that with the case of Maraba. So with these different contradictory policies, you end up having these forces that are kind of making claims over each other at the local level. You have relative land scarcity and land law, which is some of what McAdam, Taro, and Tilley would call the environmental mechanisms. You have the individual and collective identities, which might be more associated with the cognitive mechanisms, how people choose to identify with a certain movement.
You want to keep up the tradition.
Yes, I appreciate it. And at the end, you have these relational mechanisms, which are these sort of more organized movements that maybe they're like the MST or groups that are against the MST who are essentially trying to make claims over other groups. And this is where conflict and violence really stems from. And so when I say heterotopias, I'm kind of putting heterotopias and spaces of conflict into the same kind of broader category, if you will. So these heterotopias are spaces that are representative of the local manifestation of these contradictory policies and these creation of these place-based identities. And this is taken from my advisor, Cynthia's work. I tried to cite her up there. I got a little blocked out. But I think that this did a really good job of showing how at the global level there are pushes from things like the IMF and other World Bank institutions that are trying to do this move for economic development on the Amazon. And at the same time, there's also these issues of environmental concerns and indigenous rights. And so I really like the way that this shows out that how these things are scalar processes that interact, and then at the local level, that's where resource scarcity is created, and then resource competition and conflict. To expand on this a little bit in terms of heterotopias and what I mean when I say that, and as another anecdote, there's another student who's talking about utopianism and sustainable frameworks in the geography department, so it's a very interesting conversation. But there's this utopian perception of certain things like economic development, environmental protection, indigenous rights, agrarian reform, things that in general populist movements want and need. But in essence, these things can also be contradictory in terms of like their dystopian reality. In terms of economic development, we also have to consider these more socially, environmentally damaging capitalist tendencies and the movement towards environmental protection and creating more indigenous rights. There's also this more flexible and convenient policy that comes with these sort of things. So, we might have, have a great policy towards indigenous rights, but then as soon as you need the substrate resources, those indigenous rights aren't really more flexible on that. We might have areas for environmental protection, but as soon as we want to build a dam, that takes priority because it's a national security concern. Right? So the space that ends up being in between is that physical and theoretical space between these two things. What Foucault describes where the space of the other is created, where this animosity kind of tends to stem from. And it has many forms in both space and place. So to try to create more diagrams to explain this framework, on the left-hand side, we have these maybe more contradictory policies and movements that cause increased land scarcity, such as land reform, pro-development plans, environmental protection, indigenous rights. So those scalar processes really help shape these different place-based identities that are rooted in class and ethnic struggle, such as large landholders, maybe versus land conservation communities, and the indigenous groups inhabiting different reserves, and really this idea of the individual and collective identities that are embedded in different social movement organizations. But while this creates a sort of flow down to the local level, I think it's also important to note that this can be a reciprocal relationship, right? That these movements and other things have the force to create change at a national and international scale in a certain circumstance. So with that being said, and understanding that Maraba has this history of violence and tension over land-based resources, really what I want to know is how is the dam going to impact these local areas of social conflict and struggle, and more specifically, can we peel back some of the layers of these land conflicts to understand are there different dimensions going on? So one thing I was very grateful for, the Presidente Energética, the EPE in Brazil, actually makes their data available at certain points, certain times for different projects based on the work that they do for different environmental impact assessments. So I was able to get data about the size of the dam from them, and then to sort of illustrate in a little bit of a sheepish way a 10-kilometer impact buffer where we expect to see primary sources of conflict, probably at least certain rates of indirect land use change, things of that nature. And to do that, that helps us to identify the different municipalities that are going to be impacted. And then I took data from the CPT, the Comissão Passageira, to analyze these land conflicts from 2007 to 2015. And when I go a little bit more into the methods, I'll talk about why there's an asterisk there. But then I also took anchor data as well as indigenous lands data from FUNAI to sort of look at how these different areas might be impacted in terms of who's inhabiting. So I know every anthropologist in here is going to wince a little bit, but unfortunately the land conflict data comes in terms of number of families. And we know that that's a very highly subjective term. And I don't really have a good grasp or comeback to how this can really be overcome, only that is the data that we have at the moment, especially because I'm going to take this number of families data and I'm going to weight it against population estimates from 2007 to 2015 to create kind of like a rate of conflict for different municipalities. That's about per 1,000 people. And then once we have those rates, we can sort of get an idea of the frequency and magnitude of different land conflicts occurring in these impacted municipalities. And then from there, we can create a kind of location quotient, which is based off of a percentage of the total number of families impacted by conflict divided by the percentage of the total population. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question? So the assumption there is that as you have more families in some square kilometer area, there's more conflict. Do I understand that?
The data comes from the CPT, and the way that it's recorded is per year, per municipality. That's the number of families based off of newspaper articles, people reporting this, and people reporting from social media and other outlets. But those are the total number of families for that year that have been impacted or experienced land conflicts through threats of violence or violence itself in the form of murder. Does that answer your question?
No problem.
Okay. Sure.
I want to understand your quotient. So you're dividing the percent of the total number of people. Or is that percent of?
So as you'll see, there's about 13 total municipalities that are identified as potentially being impacted by the dam. So for for frequency and magnitude, we can look at those two statistics kind of across time. But in terms of a year-by-year basis, if we use a location quotient, then we can understand proportionality a little more. But that means we can only look at them 1 year at a time. So for 1 year, the percent of total number of families impacted by conflict will be the total number for all the municipalities. And then that municipality, the percentage of families is per one municipality divided by the percentage of that municipality's total population. Does that make it work? Okay, sorry.
But
So
each
using an intensity equation.
Yeah, using an intensity.
But each municipality has some kind of number, like X families.
Right, and I'll show you what this. Yes.
No, but I mean versus households or individuals.
Right.
They've
yes,
got
correct.
census data on families, which is an unusual thing.
Right.
Because most have households. But when you say households and families, you're talking about.
That's where it's really difficult and really complicated. And to make matters worse, I wanted to go back further in the CPT data. The CPT's been around since 1975. They started collecting data in 1985, but they're pretty transparent that between 1985 and 2007, they didn't really have a very formalized process of collecting land conflict based off of newspapers and first-hand reports and things of that nature. But in 2007, they started structuring surveys and other things to get more accurate data. So that's part of the reason why I chose 2007 to 2015. And to make matters more complicated, and maybe this is why they are a number of families, is that the INCRA data is also structured that way. For a given land reform settlement, you have a number of families. Right? So that kind of makes, if that helps make sense. Sorry, I know that might have been a little confusing, but that is the struggle that I've had without being able to go. And also the study area, it's up here, but it would be quite large. I think that kind of research would take a lot of time. I mean, if anything, this sort of might provide a basis for exploratory research. This helps to identify where these areas and clusters of conflict might be. So moving on, if you've read any of the environmental impact assessment reports, you see that these often at this stage, they divide them up by basin. So they do take a larger scale approach. And then in doing so, they divide them up into sub-basins, which hydrologically that makes a lot of sense, but by social standards, we might think that there are, we don't necessarily organize our communities into sub-basins. Especially it gets really complicated. Maraba is located up here. That's where the Maraba Dam will be. That's how large it'll be. And it actually runs through the confluence of two different rivers, the Tocantins and the Araguaia, which is going to come down here. So I think it's very difficult to, sort of what the EPE does, which is try to create a standardization of environmental impact assessment, but that's very difficult to do on rivers that are different sizes, rivers that have different fluvial geomorphology to them, and especially when you choose to put a dam at a really interesting point, which is obviously to maximize the flow of the confluence of two rivers, but then which environmental impact assessment should you put it on, right? Would you put it on the Araguaia because it's very close to the Araguaia, or do you put it on the Tocantins because that's technically the larger river? So from that took the area, well, the EP gave me the estimate for the reservoir size, and I just put a 10-kilometer buffer on it. And it basically gave me these 13 municipalities that potentially could experience some kind of impact, based on location. And so from there, I went and I dug out the data for each of these, and you can see for some municipalities like Maraba, which is much larger, they have high numbers, but their population is also going to be higher. And I'll show you that in a second. And then in other areas, such as Sub-Entity Tocantins, there is no reported land. So I just want to give you an idea of what that raw number of families data might look like. But if we take some look at the population, Maraba is clearly the largest area. There are other municipalities that are quite small in comparison, but that becomes sort of interesting as we look at some of these conflicts. And in general, there is a small area where there has been relatively no population growth, but in general, people are moving to these areas and continuing to move to these areas, which kind of indicate that down the line there might be even more conflicts. So if we look at these rates per 1,000 people, some trends might kind of pop out at you. One is that Maraba, which I said, of course, is the larger area. It has a much larger numbers of people involved in land conflicts, but it also has a much higher population. So their rate per 1,000 people tends to be much lower compared to some other places, such as São João do Araguaia, which has less people, but experiences land conflicts pretty frequently and sometimes at pretty high rates. And then you might notice these numbers as well in Esperantina, where they have very infrequent land conflicts, but when they do have conflicts, they're very intense. They involve a large percentage of the population. And then there are also these sort of small trends in this area where these are pretty high numbers, but as you can see, this is more frequent to when the dam would be built. And so if we look at the frequency of conflicts over the 7 or 8 year span, we can see that obviously Maraba experiences them most frequently, and then there's sort of a decay. This is São João do Araguaia, Tocantins, and Esperantina. Of course, the dam will be located right in that area. So in terms of frequency, it's something that's happening on a fairly frequent basis. But then, interestingly enough, if we look at the magnitude of the conflicts, we can see that Maraba is actually not quite as intense, but right here where the dam will be built, there is a large concentration of when conflicts do occur, they're much more intense. And to verify this, we can create that location quotient, which gives us kind of a relative measure for each year, and then sort of plotted that across. And so if the location quotient is between 0.5 and 2, and then that yellow color there, that will be around what we would consider in proportion for land conflicts. But if something is much darker, kind of orange or red color, that's actually quite high in terms of intensity compared to other areas that might have none, or of course the blue. So basically the case that I'm trying to make here is that even though there are a large number of land conflicts in the actual municipality of Maraba, these other areas, which tend to be much more rural, at least from what I can tell, have much more heated, much more intense, and in some cases equally as frequent land conflicts as others. Yeah.
The timeline of the construction and development of the project with the two, with the table,
well, this is 2007 is as far back in the data as I could go without sort of stretching into when the data is 30. That's what they yeah. Yeah, and so I was trying to establish some kind of idea of where, these different conflicts might occur, but the dam has not been built yet. There's still time to, have this discussion. But the larger critique that, sort of on the fence of putting into the thesis is that, we sort of use more analysis like this in environmental and social impact assessment to try to understand where conflicts might be occurring. Because as of now, they sort of say, oh, okay, there's people, this area has a history of land conflict, but they don't really say where. They don't really say who might be impacted. They just say, we're aware that this has happened, and basically that we're still going to build the dam.
I was trying to hold my question to that, okay. But all this is related to your data in relation to your conflict data. If you don't ponderate by the articles that you get by area, you don't have, all this is only related to the data itself. Right. Because, the data that they have by these regions depend on who is studying this region. So the magnitude and the frequency depending on how many people were there and how they could report. You have a lot of zeros in your data because some people didn't report. It doesn't explain that it doesn't exist, but that means that nobody went there and reported. So, because it's not so easy to report, that's why I'm asking, how is the report itself in the data related to, the amount of institutions it has, how would people report the conflict?
Right, people report conflict either through contacting the CPT directly, which is the most efficient way, but also through social movements, also collect this data through newspapers, which are very expensive about recording deaths and things that are conflict.
But do they have for all the regions the same amount of effort?
I don't work with the CPT, but they have land conflict data for every municipality in Bill, so that seems to indicate that they're a very strong network there. I know in the past, my advisors and other people have provided. My understanding is that it's a strong institution.
It's pretty strong.
It's strong, but South and Maraba. They report throughout that whole region. It's not a really remote region.
No. It may not be perfect, but I don't think.
No.
Yeah, that's what
I don't know people, but yeah, I mean, heard that there's a master or a unit office, or that's where the data.
One of these small towns in Florida.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question because I did have to learn a lot about how the CPT has structured them, because they've been an organization, like I said, that's been around since 1955. And in their annual reports, they have this data available that you can go through and look at. But like I said, if you go through their methods section, they'll say that, okay, we've been around since 1975, 1980 started sort of way of recording land conflicts. but it seems like between 1988 and 2005, 2007, they weren't really confident. They were using, it was possible that there were repeats. It's possible that they would take something from the newspaper that might also be said in person, and then they would have double counts and things like that. But the thing that they did say was in 2007, they standardized the survey process. Yeah. Something I had to investigate too. The only downside to this is that it doesn't really give us any idea of necessarily the trends, but where some of these hotspots might be in terms of, at least at the municipal level. But if we then take a look at the left panel here, and again, you'll see this number of families problem. But these are the different rural settlements that are INCRA sponsored, and then there's also one informal settlement on Land G, Reserva Land G, up there in the top left, just outside of Maraba, and of course the Mai Maria Indigenous Reserve. And so if we look at how some of these areas might be actually impacted, we can see that there would be a lot of inundated land uses in terms of with Land G and other settlement areas. And in particular, I think that the strength of the impact, and maybe I can't really quantify this at this moment, but I believe it would be sort of in this general area would we expect to see the most amount of resistance, at least in terms of people who have experience with organized resistance before. And so I came up with these different case studies, at least in these municipalities, to see what might be, some of the frameworks for resistance that might already be in place and potentially impacted, and really kind of reduce them to these sort of like resource-related struggles. And so in land conflict in San João do Araguaia is something that seems to occur much frequently. Some of those settlements that I showed you where the impacts were, some of those settlements have been around since the 70s. People have rights to that land. And then there's also informal settlements which might be even more willing to participate in some sort of collective action. And again, I know it's not great, but somewhere in the range, and just in that municipality alone, is about more than 500 families. And then the second case study that I look at is the Mai Maria Indigenous Reserve, the Gavião Paketeji. And what's interesting about the history of this area is that I was exploring this idea, at least, of double displacement, where when Tupuri was constructed, which is just north of Maraba, a number of the indigenous peoples actually gravitated towards this area. So the possibility that they would experience another form of displacement by another hydropower dam sort of leads us to the idea that it's been an ongoing process of reshuffling and removing people for hydropower development. And then, of course, they would be able to frame this under this, discourse that we hear a lot of violation of indigenous rights, which may or may not happen. I can't guarantee that. And then, of course, one of the smallest is the quebraderas in Esperantina, coconut breakers who have had to struggle against deforestation for a long time. Apparently, there's a large number of them that are located in northern Tocantins, the area of Esperantina that'll be inundated. So they already have this conflict, and they already, possibly the introduction of this dam could advance rates of development-induced displacement and cause them to become even more active in the area. So to conclude, I think after my discussions that I really need a more in-depth understanding of what's going on in these areas, site visits, things of that nature. If anything, this has been a good way to explore different regions of conflict, but it's very much at a meso scale. It's at a municipal scale. It's hard to understand what might be going on at the property level, which is where a lot of this organization could potentially be taking place. But in terms of environmental impact assessments, they're sort of in the same boat as I am, where it's sort of we need a sort of a further understanding of these social struggles that are going on. So yes, and I thought it would be interesting if we could have more ethnographic detail and maybe more qualitative measures of understanding of social conflict. The number of families isn't a perfect system, but obviously the CBC worked very hard over the last few years to come up with a more standardized process. And maybe more methods and frameworks for evaluating how changes in the physical landscape may generate changes in spatial temporal